Welcome back. We're going to be reading more into Exodus today. It's going to be your assignment. We're getting into a little bit more of the dry stuff of Exodus, as it were. And I want to give you a little preface before you read, so make sure you have not, well, if you've read it already, it's too late. If you haven't read it yet, you're good. So we're going to be talking about Exodus 25 through 27. All right, and what this is dealing with primarily is the building of the tabernacle. Okay, big important structure. This serves as their temple basically until that temple gets built. This is their tent where God dwells. And you get a lot of instructions about this in Exodus. We go on and on and on. It seems very specific, lots of detail. Why does this matter? Why is all of this in here? I wanted to give us some things to think about as you're reading it, some things to kind of give a little bit of a basis for some of it. All right. The first kind of basic thing, though, is that the tabernacle is all about God's holiness. All right. By the way, if you're not taking notes yet, you might want to start, pause, get your notebook out, start writing things down. All right. This holiness idea, there's a Hebrew word for it. All right. It's Kodesh. All right. And this Hebrew word, like, it does mean holiness, but it has this idea of being set apart. That if something is holy, if something is that perfect like God, it is not to be mixed in with the rest of all the everyday stuff. It is to be set apart, special, different from everything else. And that's what the tabernacle is doing. It's trying to give you a representation of what that looks like, what God's holiness means, how set apart that makes him from everyone else. So as you read this, you're going to note that there's going to be kind of like levels that it's going to go through. All right, we're going to have different kinds of levels of access. All right, and so you're going to notice that the structure itself is built so that not everyone gets the same distance near to God. Remember, in that Holy of Holies, we kind of know some of this Bible trivia already, I'm assuming. Only the high priest can go into the Holy of Holies where the ark is. And then outside of that, you have just a secondary level where only the priests can go in. Outside that, you have the courtyard where everybody else can go in, but only if you are among the Israelites. If you're an outsider, you don't get to go in there. So we're going to see a lot of different ways where it's kind of broken up so that it's a progression, that it's not just like one wall that separates you from God, but it is multiple steps, multiple ways that God is set apart. All right. You might even see this if you're reading and you're paying attention in the different kinds of metals that get described in the book. All right. You'll notice it goes from like bronze as the furthest distance away from God, and as you get closer to God, the metal that you're supposed to use in constructing all of these things gets nicer until we get to gold. So pay attention for that. Now, I wanted to give you a little heads up about some of the things you're going to read about today. All right. The obvious one that you all know, the Ark of the Covenant. All right, this is the Ark. This is the big deal. This is where the Ten Commandments goes. Remember, we talked about that. Remember, we also talked about how the manna goes in here as well. All right, this is what they carry around. This is the most holy thing because this is the thing God's going to actually be present over. This represents the seat of his presence. In fact, you know how, notice when they're describing the ark, they talk about how there's like the two cherubim kind of sitting on top. All right. This right here, this space, was called the mercy seat. This is like the actual spot of God's presence. This is also where the blood of the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement would go, kind of representing that sacrifice needed if you were going to be coming into God's presence. So pay attention for that description. Make sure you're getting a good visual on that. All right, another thing you're going to hear mentioned is a menorah. In Exodus, they'll just call it a lampstand. All right, but this is, if you think about like at Hanukkah, when you see that one candle shape, it's got the branches like that. That's the lampstand they're talking about. And this is going to be interesting. You're going to notice how they describe it is that it's decorated to be kind of like a tree. It's meant to symbolize like a tree with branches. There's going to be flowers engraved on it, all this jazz. And this is meant to give you, if you are ancient Israel and you have heard the stories of creation, if you know kind of this background, this is meant to give you some Garden of Eden vibes. All right, think about what you know existed in the Garden of Eden. It's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This tree symbol, again, remember, in the Garden of Eden, that's where God's presence was. God was walking in the garden with Adam. This is giving us a little bit of a throwback to that, of like, if God's presence is going to be here, let's have a reminder of where his presence started on earth. Things have changed now because of sin, but we're still going to have this present in our tabernacle. All right? Another thing you're going to see is they're going to have descriptions of a table, and they'll say something about the bread of the presence will get put on this table. So they're going to give all these diagrams and, dimensions for build this table, put gold on it, and the priest shall set the bread of the presence on this table. What is the bread of the presence, you might ask? It does not tell us in Exodus, but later on in the Torah, it tells us a little bit more about it. And what we know is that there would be 12 loaves of bread. Now, number 12 should ding some bells. Pretty important. In this case, each loaf is meant to represent one of the tribes of Israel. Okay? So if you have this bread, and again, this is all very symbolic, priest takes 12 loaves in, he sets them on the table. This is the bread of the presence. It's symbolizing him bringing God's people into God's presence. If you are one of Israel, you're in one of these 12 tribes, your presence is represented in this bread of the presence. Okay? That's all I think you're going to read in these 2 chapters. There's some more stuff coming up. We'll get to that later. But something to think about, and you're going to be answering a discussion question on this, is thinking about why all of this matters. Like, this is all very symbolic. It's a good literary term, right? That things are symbolic. They stand for something. They represent something. Why would God do all of this? God can make things happen however he wants. He chooses to make this very complex, very ornate, very specific requirement for how his presence can be among his people. So I'm going to want you to think about, as you read, like, what does all of this mean? Like, what does it stand for? If I were an ancient Israelite, what would seeing all of this help me understand about God? How could I learn more about him, grow in relationship with him differently because he's put all of this in place? All right, so this is maybe a little tough to wade through, but it is worth getting into. It's worth reading through carefully because this is very foundational to Israel's worship structure. The whole 40 years out in the wilderness, this goes with them everywhere. This is God's presence. It's a huge deal because of that. You do not mess around with the presence of God. So, read carefully, read thoughtfully, and when you're done, go back on Google Classroom and work on that discussion question for me. All right, and again, if you have any questions, if you need to talk more, you're welcome to reach out for me. I am happy to explain further. All right, good luck.